So hello and welcome to all for joining us for today's session on nuclear weapons-free zones. This is part 2 of a two-part webinar series on nuclear weapons-free zones. The first part was held 1 week ago, and for those who were unable to attend, we'll post the link in the chat so you can listen in on that session as well. That session sort of laid the groundwork for the continuation now in today's event. So just to quickly mention, in the first part, we had discussed what are nuclear weapons-free zones, why are they important, and then we heard perspectives from the Latin American nuclear weapons-free zone, the Tlatelolco Treaty. We heard perspectives as well from Tarja Kronberg on sort of the legal implications and the loopholes within some of these nuclear weapons-free zones, as well as some remarks from civil society on what our role is in reinforcing nuclear weapons-free zones and how we can contribute to them. Today, we are expanding that conversation to look at other possible nuclear weapons-free zones, areas that are at high risk of possible nuclear accidents or all-out nuclear war. Quite difficult moments. So it's my honor to present our speakers for today's session. We have Sooyoung Hwang from People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, or PSPD. Then we have Emad Kiyaei from the Middle East Treaty Organization. Please excuse my butchering of the last name there. And then we also have Kate Hudson from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. And as you might be able to imagine, these speakers will be speaking of a Northeast Asian nuclear weapons-free zone possibility, Middle East nuclear weapons-free zone, or wider implications of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East. And then we will also be discussing the nuclear situation in Europe and the need for a nuclear-free Europe, and how a nuclear weapons-free zone can contribute in these regions to reducing tensions, reducing the risk of nuclear weapons, and again, perhaps looking at how civil society can play a role to bring these regions to discussions on nuclear weapons-free zones and the eventual abolition of nuclear weapons. We also hope that our moderator from the last session, Dr. Enkhsaikhan, Jargalsaikhan from Blue Banner Mongolia, will be joining us. We've had some technical difficulties, but I'm hoping he'll be with us in a little while here to provide some closing remarks and his thoughts on where we move from this. So without further ado, I will give the floor to our first speaker, Sooyoung, to begin her presentation. Sooyoung, please go ahead.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, thank you for inviting me today. I'm happy to be here. Today, I would like to talk about the Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone and the current situation of the nuclear conflict on the Korean Peninsula. So, yeah, Northeast Asia is an area where regional approaches have not developed and there is no regional security cooperation system. The bilateral conflict is also serious. For example, the conflict between the two Koreas and US DPRK, South Korea and Japan, and US and China. But we know the national security is deeply interdependent with other nations. So, but it is important that we have a common security perspective in Northeast Asia. And in Northeast Asia is home to the nuclear weapon states, US, Russia, and China, and nuclear armed state North Korea. And Japan and South Korea are under the US nuclear umbrella. The potential for nuclear war is very high in this region. As you know, there is a very serious nuclear conflict centered on the Korean Peninsula. South Korea, the US, and North Korea are announcing and practicing a preemptive strike strategy against their opponent. It is very dangerous situation. And South Korea and the US are practicing operational plans, including preemptive strikes and leadership beheading, and are frequently deploying fighter jets capable of dropping nuclear weapons on the Korean Peninsula under the name of extended deterrence. In response, North Korea has also announced the law on the DPRK's nuclear forces policy that said it could preemptively use nuclear weapons if an attack is deemed imminent or if the leadership is threatened. The vicious cycle of nuclear arms race is repeating in this region. Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone has long been proposed as a way to resolve the nuclear conflict on the Korean Peninsula. The Northeast Asia nuclear weapon-free zone is a proposal in which the three countries of South Korea, North Korea, and Japan would sign a nuclear weapon-free zone treaty. And the three neighboring nuclear weapon states, the US, Russia, and China, would declare their respect the nuclear weapon-free zone, including negative security assurance. I believe this could be more realistic way to peacefully resolve the nuclear conflict on the Korean Peninsula and make Northeast Asia safe from nuclear weapons. But it is an issue that must be addressed comprehensively with peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula. Peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula and a nuclear weapon-free zone in Northeast Asia could be extended to a common security order in Northeast Asia. To do so, the current military confrontation on the Korean Peninsula must be resolved first. So South Korean civil society is calling for the following to ease the current military tensions and reopen the path to dialogue. The first thing is the countries concerned must immediately stop all military actions that intensifies military tensions on the peninsula. The countries must recognize that armed protest only intensify the vicious cycle and can never be a solution. In particular, South Korea and US need to take preemptive measures to reduce military threats against North Korea, such as suspending combined military exercises. It is urgent to restore trust and create conditions for the dialogue to resume. The US, as you know, has the strongest military power in the world, and South Korea spends more than 1.5 times the total GDP of North Korea on military spending alone. So South Korea and the US, which have an overwhelming advantage in economic and military power over North Korea, should act first. If anyone doesn't change, we can expect change. The second one, we believe that the fundamental way to solve the conflict on the Korean Peninsula is to resolve the hostile relations, which has been continued in 70 years. Complete denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula is impossible unless the unstable ceasefire is ended, hostile relations are converted into general diplomatic relations, mutual trust is established, and military threats are resolved. Yet, however, this will become more and more impossible as time goes by. Peace negotiations should begin and dealing comprehensively and effectively with the conclusion of peace agreement, improvement of the DPRK-US and the DPRK-Japan relations, and denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. And denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula cannot be achieved solely by the CVID of North Korea. The policy of relying on nuclear weapons, including the US nuclear umbrella, upon which South Korea and Japan depend, must also end. So these steps would create the conditions for establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in Northeast Asia, and all states in the region joining the TPNW. I think this is the way to protect the safety of all residents of the Korean Peninsula and East Asia. Yeah, my story is, yeah, this is my speech is as for now. So yeah, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sooyoung. It's very important that we look at the steps that we need to work towards a nuclear weapons-free zone, that they can't just come out of thin air, and that we need to be able to build trust, restore trust, and also that nuclear weapons-free zones, once established, of course, can be part of a larger process for peace and for common security in the region. So I very much thank you for bringing all this in and giving us the information on the current situation as well as the path forward. Our next speaker for today's session is Emad, who will speak on the Middle East region and the work that is being done, the great work that's being done by the Middle East Treaty Organization to advance a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the region. Emad, please go ahead.
Thank you, Sean. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and thank you for the invitation to speak about the Middle East, the easiest region of stability, as you can imagine. In a world where we have this current conflict between Russia and Ukraine that has expanded to other NATO countries, it seems like the Middle East is actually a beacon of hope when it comes to the issues of advancing a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. And I'll get to why I say that once we have a little bit of a better overview of what we're trying to achieve in this region. The idea of a nuclear weapons-free zone in the Middle East dates back decades to 1974, when Egypt and Iran proposed it at the United Nations. That expanded to include other classes of weapons of mass destruction, namely chemical and biological weapons, in 1990, to establish a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. Now, as you all well know, establishing a nuclear weapons-free zone itself is already a huge feat to accomplish. Now, imagine when we throw in biological and chemical weapons into the mix. So it's not easy. The major milestone that came about was in 1995, where the indefinite extension of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, was attached to making advances on establishing such a zone. And that was the bargain they made with a lot of the Arab countries, which were quite fed up with the promises of world powers in helping establish such a zone in the region. That was in 1995. Let's fast forward as quickly as we can to where we are today. After many failed attempts on establishing a conference where these regional countries can discuss how to go about establishing such a zone in 2012, in 2015, we can go back in time in all of those failed attempts, which were primarily not because of the Arab countries or Iran, but primarily because of the objections Israel, the only nuclear weapon state in the region, had on starting such a process, whereby they felt they would be singled out. And backed by the United States, it led to the derailment of those initiatives. But in 2018, something changed. By trying to push through this process within the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Arab group plus Iran decided to, in parallel, initiate a United Nations General Assembly resolution that then brought it out of the NPT process and introduced another sort of avenue to establish such a zone. That led to the resolution that called for an annual conference for the establishment of a WMD-free zone to occur at the UN headquarters in New York on an annual basis until, and this is the mandate, until every single regional country, which includes the 22 Arab states from the Arab League, plus Iran and Israel, including the P5 nuclear weapon states who are also going to be in the room, to come up with a treaty text that they can actually agree on consensus-based approach and freely arrived at. In the room in New York, in 2019, the first of this conference occurred under the presidency of Jordan. And we were very lucky from the Middle East Treaty Organization to be there because we also played a fundamental role in pushing through such a resolution and calling for the treaty to be moved forward. And for me, it was shocking because you could see 22 Arab countries plus Iran in the room with the P5 nuclear weapon states in the peripheral side of the room in a conference room, well, was it, 1 or 2 in the basement. But just the visualization of seeing the Middle Eastern countries actually taking control over their own security and wanting to advance such a cause was in itself empowering. That first conference began with a lot of low expectation and a lot of attempts by the United States and other naysayers in making sure that it doesn't actually succeed in any outcome. But everybody was blown away with the fact that at the end of this 3-day conference, the states that were present there, with the exception of only 2 from the region, Israel, and from the P5, United States. Their seats are there, it's just empty. And they reached a final document, final statement in calling for this process to continue. We fast forward to the second conference on such a zone. In that, this process moved quite fast in identifying thematic areas where they're going to actually discuss. How does a zone look like? How do we verify? How do we discuss the means of delivery? What will enforcement look like? Entry into force? What are the mechanisms of just the logistics or the administrative side of it? What policies should be enacted? All of these questions were starting to now brew up and come into these thematic areas that were identified. The last conference was held in November 2022. Again, Meta was present there as one of the few civil society organizations who have an observer status to be present in New York over these conversations. And we have to admit that many of the ambassadors at the end of that session were very hopeful in terms of where we are going with this process. In a very short span of time in diplomatic terms, they have reached quite a level of consensus already on some key issues on how will this zone look like. They have used, and they admit to it, a lot of the draft treaty text that the Middle East Treaty Organization has developed over the years, and we continuously improve upon it as the geopolitical realities on the ground change. And of course, we bring in the technical and legal avenues that these countries can utilize to advance the zone. I'm saying this because it requires regional countries, if they want to advance non-proliferation and disarmament, to have a conversation first and foremost among themselves. And that is the power when it comes to nuclear weapons-free zones. Tarja Kronberg just mentioned it in the first session about the fact that 118 countries, or a little bit more, a little bit less, fall under different nuclear weapons-free zones. As a collective, this is a strong, powerful voice that can play a leading role in to advance global disarmament. Now, that's the rosy picture that I wanted to paint initially on where we are with a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. But we're not there yet. There is no agreement yet. The negotiations continue. Israel is not in the room, and that's the only nuclear weapon state we've got in the region. And efforts to get Israel to disarm its nuclear weapons is a process on its own. The fact that the United States has not even been participating in this process in itself says volumes to the fact that it cannot even openly state the fact that we are actually making progress. And their presence in the room could have been quite helpful. But because it's consensus-based, being in the room gives you a voice, gives you a way for you to navigate through this process that could be historical in nature. And being outside of the room basically removes you from any form of impact in the process. So we welcome and we encourage the United States and Israel to hopefully participate in the upcoming conference on the WMD-free zone that will be again held in November. The beauty of this is, as I mentioned, the mandate is to reach a consensus-based, freely arrived at treaty text. That may take 4 years, 5 years, or 20 years. But the door is there, the venue is there, the participants are there, and there is enormous movement in the right direction, at least from what we are seeing from regional countries, heavyweights, including Egypt and Iran, Jordan, and others, who are actively trying to advance this prospect. But there are challenges. And since the title of my discussion should be on challenges, I'm going to throw in 4 or 5, and of course, we'll hopefully have time over it in Q&A. JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, where is it? Well, it's in dire conditions, most probably even dead as we speak. To revive that agreement will take a lot of political will and heavyweight lifting from those countries that are signatories to the Iran nuclear deal, namely the P5, plus Germany, European Union, and Iran. Trump's removal in 2018 has caused a tremendous amount of uncertainty over Iran's nuclear program. And as you're all aware, as you can see in the news, Iran's nuclear program, since they have also decided not to conform to the JCPOA, has expanded, has accelerated, and they have reached levels of enrichment that is the closest to weapons grade we've ever seen Iran achieve. This is troublesome when there is less inspections, less oversight, and less monitoring of that program. So we hope that that major blunder that Trump undertook can be reversed. And if it is, then it will require renewed negotiations between Iran and the world powers on how does a new JCPOA look like. Saudi Arabia is another major issue because they are expanding their nuclear program. And they are, unlike Iran, are not seen as an adversary of the United States, and therefore have been able to, under the watch of the international community, expand their program and accelerate it to levels that we are seeing becoming increasingly worrisome in this game of trying to also achieve a domestic understanding of a whole nuclear fuel cycle that could open up Saudi Arabia into diverting to weaponization. So have an eye on that program. Of course, Israel's nuclear weapons program remains central to the challenge of realizing a WMD-free zone in the Middle East. And here, really, the way to get to Israel disarming its nuclear weapons runs through Washington as the biggest security guarantor of the state of Israel and its ability to enforce pressure where necessary. It is important that the United States at some point realizes that for the best interest, national interest of Israel itself, it will be necessary for that country to disarm in a region that is volatile. Finally, I think the lack of a regional security apparatus in the region brings this conventional weapons and non-conventional weapons on a convergence track, whereby we cannot operate in a region which is one of the most volatile in the world without having an understanding amongst regional countries on what does a common security apparatus look like. Now, there has been some recent developments with the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, brokered by the Iraqis and the Chinese, that gives us some new hope that can expand into the GCC, into the Gulf Cooperation Council countries and Iran in reducing the tensions. But the Cold War that we're seeing between Iran and Israel is going to continue. And the assassinations, sabotage, and the realm of cyber attacks is becoming increasingly worrisome, not just in the region, but globally. And I will end with the fact that we cannot expect Israel in the short term or even in the long term to disarm its nuclear weapons when the rest of these nuclear weapon states put so much emphasis on the deterrence or the validity or the necessity of nuclear weapons. And at this critical juncture in which direction our international community will go, we have to nip it at its bud by saying that nuclear weapons are just not necessary within our defense and national security doctrines, because, as you all well know, the impact and the outcome of a nuclear war will be devastating to all of us, no matter where you sit, in Moscow, in Kiev, or in Washington. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emad, for that really great overview. Many points to be hopeful for, but also not forgetting the challenges that we still have in front of us for a weapons of mass destruction free zone in the Middle East. I think there's a lot that we can bring up to continue that conversation when we get to the Q&A. But for now, I will give the floor to our third and final speaker, Kate Hudson, to speak about the situation in Europe. Kate, please go ahead.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Sean, and it's good to be in this important discussion today. And I think perhaps challenges is the key word that I would draw out there when we're talking about the situation in Europe and the possibility of a nuclear weapons-free zone. And as other speakers have commented, you know, the Ukraine conflict above all today demonstrates the need for a nuclear weapons-free Europe. And of course, the demand for a nuclear weapons-free zone in Europe is a very long-standing one over many decades. It was particularly powerful as a demand in the 1980s, but that demand has dissipated, and it's very hard to point to any really serious constructive discussion of such a zone outside of the peace movement. We do talk about it in the peace movement, we make links and so on, but in terms of wider institutions, it's very, very slim pickings indeed. And the only thing, even in the United Nations framework, that I could see recently was a conference organized on a European zone by UNIDIR from the United Nations in Geneva in 2015, and that was led by the Swiss Foreign Affairs Department. But otherwise, it's hard to see anything like the level of traction on this issue as there is indeed, of course, in the Middle East, where there is, as Emad was outlining, very, very serious progress. So, as I'm sure you will all be aware, there are very difficult and complex factors when it comes to such a project in Europe. We have the concentration of nuclear weapons states and nuclear weapons in Europe, I think really largely owing to its position as a global center of power in the 20th century. I mean, even leaving aside for a moment the question of United States nuclear weapons on the continent, the UK and France, both as imperialist powers over centuries, their role as victors in World War II, their role in the construction of the post-Second World War settlement, all those things are factors in how nuclear weapons have evolved in Europe. And of course, I think, I mean, I'm very aware of this from a UK perspective, and I think it's probably the same in France, wanting to maintain the country's role in the world, its status as a nation in the post-Second World War period, and seeing nuclear weapons as a way to ensure that, you know, and I think that that remains, it's certainly in British establishment dialogue. That is certainly still very much the case here. And then, of course, in the specific context of the Cold War, the post-war conflict of systems between sort of US framework, Soviet framework, and so on. As we know, for a period, the US had a sole monopoly on nuclear weapons in the immediate post-war period. But then, of course, the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons by 1949. So that, of course, changed the situation and sort of put, because of Europe's status as a kind of divided continent between the two great power systems, that again, of course, put Europe in the center between that kind of potential nuclear conflict situation. So the US, of course, had and has specific nuclear roles in Europe, particularly when it was a key front in the Cold War. There were others, of course, but there's a key front in the Cold War. So as just as an example of the scale of the problem that we faced, in 1971, there were 7,300 US nuclear weapons in Europe. And of course, part of the Soviet Union, the Western part of the Soviet Union, was kind of seen as Europe, but in the sense that politically we understand it, you would see Soviet Union probably as outside of Europe in this context. And then not only US nukes in Europe, but if you look at the United Kingdom and its nuclear weapons system, those nuclear missiles were always and remain US nuclear missiles. And of course, UK nuclear weapons are a co-production between the US and the UK. So that's a kind of another kind of form of US nuclear power in Europe. And then, of course, nowadays, although most of those weapons have gone, we know that there are around 100 to 200 US nuclear weapons across Western Europe. And we also know that far from them being on the way out, finally, as was hoped in the early years of the Obama administration, we know that they are being upgraded, given more capabilities. So in effect, the new replacement, the B-6112s, in effect, they will be first strike capacity weapons. And we also know that the UK is now being added back into that list of recipients for US nuclear weapons, direct US nuclear weapons, in the same way as Germany, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. So far from the problem kind of continuing to dissipate as it appeared to be, in the last year or two, we have seen that problem beginning to increase again. And in fact, I saw a report in Deutsche Welle this morning saying that the kind of net number of nuclear weapons is now on the increase again, having been decreasing, according to SIPRI figures, for quite some time. So in terms of demands for a nuclear weapons-free zone, the greatest demand came in the 1980s. I'm sure some people on the call will remember those days when President Reagan reignited the Cold War after the 70s détente period. And his decision to send cruise and Pershing missiles to Europe, these are medium-range nuclear forces, his decision to do that to counter Soviet SS-20s based in the Western Soviet Union kind of triggered this massive wave of protest in Western Europe. And in short, I would say that the reason for that massive wave of protest is that it was pretty clear to everyone then that what it meant was that a US-Soviet nuclear war could be fought in Europe. You wouldn't have, we'd be just in the middle looking as the weapons flew overhead between the US and Soviet Union. Their war would be in Europe. And so we saw the rejection by millions. And I think one of the things that I find particularly interesting is in not wanting to be a kind of pawn between, or the battleground between the superpowers, there was a strong desire for non-alignment at that time. And of course, we know that non-alignment was a very strong factor in the nuclear weapons-free zones of the global south, for example. And there's a kind of increasing discussion about non-alignment at the moment. So that was very, very significant at that time. And of course, here in Britain, one of the great initiatives was END, the Campaign for European Nuclear Disarmament, which had at its heart the call for a European nuclear weapons-free zone. That was initiated in 1980 by the historian and theorist E.P. Thompson. So the result of all that and changes, historic global changes, Gorbachev and all that sort of thing, the result was the INF Treaty, which outlawed a whole class of nuclear weapons, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. And Cruz left, Greenham Common and all those other great things. So that was obviously a fantastic step forward, but it didn't go further than that. You know, it got rid of those weapons, but it didn't go further than that. And the other weapons remained. So, and of course, Emad, you were talking about Trump trashing the JCPOA, where of course Trump also trashed the INF Treaty, you know, so the door is open again to new intermediate range missiles, you know, not only the so-called tactical nukes, short range nukes, but it's now open to these intermediate range. So Europe faces a big and increasing problem. In short, we're tied into NATO nukes on a number of levels. So we've got the upgraded NATO nukes coming to the 6 countries, 5 of which are non-nuclear states, by the way. So, you know, big, in other words, it's illegal under the NPT for them to actually have them. There's all kinds of small print that people claim, but there's that. Then there's the US and UK forces, nuclear forces within NATO, which are kind of all over Europe. And then, of course, there's quick mention for the French nuclear weapons system, which is non-NATO. It's not tied into the NATO nuclear framework, but nevertheless, it's the force de frappe. I think it's around about 300 nuclear weapons. That's a significant thing as well. So, you know, Europe's pretty much stuffed full of these things. And as we've heard over the last week, there's a possible Russian deployment of so-called tactical nukes in Belarus, which of course the Russians justify on the basis that it's pretty much the same thing as those NATO nukes in Europe, and pretty much is the same. It doesn't make it right. It's all wrong, you know, it's all wrong. So looking for a way forward, I think colleagues have touched on kind of common security theme, and I suppose that discussion of a new common security architecture and basing European security on different principles, I think that is central to our work going forward. I can't see any quick and easy way to a nuclear weapons-free zone in Europe, but there are definitely steps that can be taken by the peace movement and by our allies across civil society, and of course the overwhelming majority of states that wish to see the end of nuclear weapons. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kate, for going over the history and moments where we were closer or farther away from ridding Europe of nuclear weapons, free zone in parts of Europe, and moments such as now where we find ourselves quite a bit further away and where the tensions are incredibly high and quite concerning, but that again shows us the need for renewed efforts and a stronger movement against nuclear weapons in Europe. And I think there is some great work being done by many organizations. Of course, we have within the IPB network and our close partners, the Nuclear Weapons Free Europe or Nuke Free Europe network, where we are campaigning and taking action. So those who are located in Europe and interested in those issues, certainly we can encourage you to be in contact with us, and we will keep you updated on all the activities of that network. Very happy to say that now we have Enkhsaikhan, Jargalsaikhan from Blue Banner Mongolia, who is in the call with us. And so I will give the floor to him next to follow up on the remarks of our speakers and discuss what some of the next steps needed will be. Enkhsaikhan, please, the floor is yours. You're muted as well.
Thank you very much, Sean. I would like to say that I have made a presentation, and I hope that Theo will be able to provide it to you, the main points of the presentation. I'll be speaking on basic point on the single state zone issue, addressing, I would say, nuclear weapon free zone Achilles heel, it's called. I'll be focusing on three issues. First, why the issue? Why all of a sudden the single state zone issue? The second is why we call it as Achilles heel. And third, what needs to be done? These are the three main areas that I would like to focus on. The first one is why the issue, why the single state nuclear weapon free zone issue. It has history, I think, in connection with Mongolia, with the Cold War period. During the Cold War period, we had two Cold Wars, East-West and Sino-Soviet, and we were part of these two Cold Wars. In 1960s and 70s, there was Sino-Soviet ideological difference, then interstate and then border problems between China and the Soviet Union. At that time, Mongolia sided with the Soviet Union. And in 1967, the Soviets established military bases in Mongolia. Again, they were focused on the East-West as well as Sino-Soviet disputes. Then in 1969, Sino-Soviet border clashes along the Ussuri River has brought many casualties on both sides, the Soviet Union and the Chinese side. Soviets were thinking of making then at that time preemptive strike against China, including, of course, the nuclear facilities. China, as I know and was reading from the press, on the other hand, was digging many tunnels and dispersing some of their military installations in preparation for the assault and response, whatever response that would be. Then the Soviet Union informed its intention to its Warsaw Pact allies, also informed the United States as the second of the two superpowers as to get its reaction. The US response was that that would lead to World War III in short. And since Mongolia hosted Soviet military bases with dual-use weapons, the US had weapons trained on Mongolia as well. We learned that later on. So the lesson at that time was that Mongolia was a legitimate target of other nuclear weapon states. So one of the first things that the new Mongolia, which was established in after the Soviet Union and Soviet bloc has disintegrated, the new Mongolia, one of the first things that it did is that it, bearing in mind the weapons, the lessons of the Cold War, it declared Mongolia a nuclear weapon-free zone. Not only declared, but the president went to the General Assembly and said that, you know, Mongolia will be working to have that nuclear weapon-free status internationally guaranteed. That was in 1992. So at that time, like other countries, you know, the B5 welcomed the initiative, but practically were reluctant to support it, since that would set a precedent for others. including perhaps even for some of their allies as well. So after the more than 80 rounds of talks with the P5, they in 2012 have agreed to provide us with political security assurances to respect the status and not to contribute to any act that would violate it. That was why we began this issue. During that time, Blue Banner, the organization that I represent, has undertaken a study on not only on Mongolia's case, but on single state zones cases, and came to a conclusion that nuclear weapon-free zones have Achilles heel. Now I'll go to the second part of my statement. Why Achilles heel? You see, the current definition and practice of nuclear weapon-free zones has a Swiss cheese effect, I would say. Not inclusive, many blind spots, and legal loopholes in nuclear weapon-free zones. Nearly 24 states and non-self-governing territories are not covered by traditional regional zones due to the geographical location or for some other credible political or legal reason. Cumulatively, by number, individual states that are affected are larger than Central Asian or Southeast Asian zones, and the territories are much larger than these two nuclear weapon-free zones as well. Even Mongolia itself has a territory which is as large, almost as large as Western Europe. So this underlines the fact that not every country, not every territory may be covered by nuclear weapon-free zones, and that should be the Achilles heel of nuclear weapon-free zones. So we believe that ignoring the rights of individual states illegally contravenes the UN Charter, meaning sovereign equality of states, right of states to individual and or collective self-defense according to Article 51 of the Charter, and the principle of equal and legitimate security for all is violated because of them. Geographically, with the increase of rivalry or strategic competition, to say it mildly, of great powers, time and space are becoming critical factors affecting stability. Rivalry, especially in Europe today, as well as in Indo-Pacific, including lately in the Western Pacific, attest to that rivalry. International practice has shown again and again that individual and small states are usually tried to be used as pawns in great power games. Hence, high risk of threat or use of threat of nuclear weapons against individual states are higher than, let's say, against military blocs or on territories of nuclear weapon states. And we should have that in mind. Recognition of single state zones would turn, in my view, blind spots or legal loopholes into indispensable building blocks of nuclear weapon-free zones and the nuclear weapon-free world, and would contribute to conflict prevention, confidence building. However, I understand and should underline that it's up to every individual state to decide for themselves whether to make use of political and legal protection that can be provided by international law, international relations, or find other ways to promote its security. Of course, that means, alliance with another country and so on. Now, what needs to be done to address this Achilles heel of nuclear weapon-free zones? We believe that United Nations General Assembly should, by its decision, make nuclear weapon-free zone inclusive. It is not inclusive. As I said, almost 24 countries are not included in the definition and in practice of nuclear weapon-free zones. What is needed, I believe, is to undertake a second comprehensive study of nuclear weapon-free zones. The first one was undertaken in 1975, almost 50 years ago, which would include this second comprehensive study should include some of the issues that were raised, let's say, during the first meeting that we had a week ago and during this meeting, the two webinars. That should include the question of strengthening the P5 security assurances to nuclear weapon-free zones. It's not, it is difficult to consider them as assurances. Maybe statements of their intention, yes, but not legally bind nuclear weapon-free zone assurances. Because you see, the nuclear weapon state have signed an international agreement based on international law that they will not have nuclear weapons on their territory. So in return, what is expected and what was written in the definition of nuclear weapon-free zones in 1975, that the P5 would also provide illegally based assurances, which we don't see except for the Tlatelolco Treaty. Then I would say that we should also make sure that the interests of, as I said, the individual states should also be reflected in the study, and some, let's say, recommendations should come out from this study, how to make these individual states become part of the developing nuclear weapon-free zones. I think this is very important, I think. Then, as I believe that though there are 4 countries that are not parties to the NPT but have nuclear weapons, they are called, I think, states with nuclear weapons. We should not disregard them or their possible role. That does not mean that, you know, we should disregard them. So this is also should be reflected in the second comprehensive study of nuclear weapon-free zones. And of course, for nuclear weapon-free zones to play an important role, they should also strengthen their cooperation and make, let's say, from time to time, statements on behalf of, let's say, 118, 120 countries on this issue. That's, I think, is very important. These are the things that I want to raise with you. And if you have any questions, I'll be more than happy to speak to you on this question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Enkhsaikhan, for showing us not only where some loopholes still exist, but also, you know, the steps that we can take to work within the existing framework, but also to increase that framework to include more, including single-state nuclear weapons-free zones. That concludes our presentations for today's session. We now will open up for question and answer. So if you have a question, you can directly use the raise your hand feature or write to us in the chat. I see we already have a first question, so I will give the floor to Davis to ask your question. Please go ahead.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So to all of the people who are in the meeting from different parts of the world, it was a fantastic presentation. I missed the first half a bit. Sorry for introducing myself through a mobile. It's because of my laptop. So I just want to ask, so myself, Davis, I'm a student in international relations in Moscow. I do my master's in multilateral diplomacy from Moscow State Institute of International Relations. My question is about the current scenario that we face due to the conflict that we have in the between Ukraine and Russia, because recently UK was talking about, or UK said that they will be sending uranium depleted shells to the Ukraine for their military operations against Russia. So how is this going to evolve into a new nuclear age, where or how is this going to evolve into a new arms race in this current scenario? I don't know whom to address this question, but anyone can take the answer. We know that depleted uranium weapons are not that effective because they are depleted, but they have a massive, they can have a lot of radiation effect in them. So how is it going to change the existing treaties and ideas of how not to use nuclear weapons in the current world? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I think it's very important that we also ask about depleted uranium as sort of this middle ground between something that is nuclear, that does have radiation and consequences. Do any of our speakers want to go first? Kate, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Davis, for that question. And it's something that here in the UK we've been very distressed and disturbed by. Of course, depleted uranium weapons don't cause a nuclear explosion. As you say, they're depleted. But of course, they are well known to have very, very severe health and environmental consequences. And although there is some attempt by institutions and so on to kind of gloss over that, we know from repeated usage of those weapons, particularly by the US and UK, in former Yugoslavia in the 1990s, in the first Gulf War, and in the Iraq War 20 years ago, and subsequently in Syria and so on. There are very serious radiation type consequences. I won't go into too much detail, but in terms of the impact, cancers, for example, particularly lymphomas, those types of cancers, but also evidence of child deformities as a result of impact on pregnant women and so on. So this is very, very well documented. And it's, of course, it's the impact on the population, that civilian population is one thing. So our approach, this is the last thing the poor Ukrainian people need is this kind of dirty and very damaging weaponry. But of course, it's not only civilians, it's also the soldiers involved as well, because it impacts not only the surrounding area, but people who use people who use the depleted uranium weapons, people on the receiving end of them in military terms, and also, of course, people who go in to clear up afterwards. The teams, we know evidence from the teams, the US Army teams, for example, who went in to clear up in previous occasions, virtually the whole team died of the consequences of DU, afterwards and so on. So it's a disastrous thing. Unfortunately, there is currently no single treaty that outlaws the use of depleted uranium, but of course many countries are particularly opposed to it. I think Belgium was the first country to ban DU munitions. I think that was around 2007. The Italian government has had very serious concerns because of the impact on its soldiers who were in a conflict where DU was used. The European Parliament has repeatedly called for DU weaponry to be outlawed. So very, very, very bad news indeed for the civilian population. It's a shame on the UK government that it's sending that kind of weaponry out there. In terms of it escalating the conflict, I think there is more to be concerned about with the kind of sending of the newly upgraded US NATO nuclear weapons back into Western Europe. That's more of an escalatory threat, I think. But in terms of any kind of basic humanitarian law framework, completely unacceptable to send DU into that conflict.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Does anyone else want to comment on that question, or do we have any other questions? Okay, Okay. Oh, Enkhsaikhan, did I see your hand there? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. No, I think it is a very important issue because though it is not called as a nuclear weapon or a form of nuclear weapon, but it has really have devastating consequences, as Kate has already underlined. This is a very important issue. But I believe that these days, it's not only this issue, but the question of the threat of use of nuclear weapons against any other country or on the territory of a country which does not have nuclear or has given away its nuclear weapons is a very, very big issue, a dangerous issue. And it should not serve as a precedent for others, because others, might follow this precedent. So if non-nuclear weapon state would like to pronounce themselves on these issues, then Blue Banner as an NGO, will be more than happy to be part of it and add even our voices, because this might set a very bad precedent if nobody, will raise their voices. I think the Japanese NGOs have already raised their voices, but only very few of them. So I think that we should focus on this question as well. I don't know what we can do as nuclear weapon-free zone countries. We meet every 3-4 years, just prior to the NPT review conference. We try to make joint statements, but the last 2 times, we were not able to meet and focus on this issue because some of the members of the nuclear weapon-free zones in Africa have raised the question of representation of Western Sahara and so on, and there was no agreement on that issue. And I don't think that issue should be discussed at the Conference of Nuclear Weapon-Free Zones. It should be discussed at the African Union level. Maybe if they want an international recognition, that the question should be addressed to the General Assembly of the United Nations. But unfortunately, we were not able to focus on these important issues. So hopefully, a few weeks prior to the next review conference, we'll be able to have a strong joint voice on this and related issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Enkhsaikhan. Do any of our other panelists want to say a few words, or if not, again, we are open to questions. You can write in the chats, or you can raise your hand, preferably using the raise the hand feature. Otherwise, I'll be looking if you want to physically raise your hand, if there are any other questions here. Okay, I'm not seeing any other hands for now. Yeah, perhaps I will ask just quite broadly for civil society organizations and peace movements such as the International Peace Bureau, CND, Blue Banner, and of course beyond all around the world, including those maybe who are already in nuclear weapons-free zones in Latin America, in Africa. How can we actively contribute towards the next steps for nuclear weapons-free zones, whether it be in our own areas or in extending them? I think there have already been some answers to that throughout the presentation, but maybe just asking, how can we support the work that's already being done in the Middle East, in Northeast Asia, and in Europe, when maybe some of us are located even outside of those areas? What role can we play then? I'll start with Enkhsaikhan. I see his hand, and maybe we just go around Emad next, and then to the others. Please go ahead.
Well, as I have already said, the first comprehensive study on nuclear weapon-free zones was undertaken in 1975. So many, 4 or 5 nuclear weapons-free zones have already been established. They have, I think, a lot of experience to share what to do and how to do it. I would say that the most I would say, not very much controversial nuclear weapon-free zones have already been established. The ones that we're talking about, let's say the Northeast Asian nuclear weapon-free zone, or nuclear weapons, and other weapons of mass destruction-free zone in the Middle East, they are not going to be very easy. So the second study should raise these issues as well. This is very important. And to undertake such a study, I think we would have to ask the General Assembly to undertake a second study and come up with their views and suggestions. And it would be good if NGOs that deal with such issues are also invited to contribute their ideas. It is very important because, as I know, the first study that was undertaken in 1975, there were only less than 30 countries representatives that were picked and chosen by the P5 or by the Soviet Union and the United States. And not many countries were represented from the developing countries. There were some, of course, but not many of them. Now the situation is different. And for example, in the question relating the single state zones, there will be many other countries that would be interested in, I think, as I have already underlined. So I think we should see what kind of study would be produced and what kind of recommendations will be there. I'm sure that when the General Assembly asks for a study, they turn to all member states for their comments, questionnaire, and so on. And then the question would be discussed by experts and then come up with their agreed, let's say, study on this issue. I think this is very important. And one thing that I want to underline, I think I have already mentioned, is that we should not disregard the 4 nuclear armed states. They should not be ignored as well. They are part of the United Nations system. Just because that they are not party to the NPT does not mean that the study should not involve them as well. Let us see what kind of role they can play, or let them hear the views of those countries that are parties to the NPT treaty and so on and so forth. So I would say that, we should start with this General Assembly resolution asking for the second study. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Enkhsaikhan. Emad, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. My comments would be first and foremost to see this as connecting the global push for disarmament. We're talking about 9 countries taking the rest of the world hostage. Let's be very clear about that. From those 9 to possess 90% of the nuclear warheads. So let's not lose our sight on the target. We have new tools. The TPNW, the Nuclear Ban Treaty, provides us now a legal sort of grounds through which we can emphasize our collective push for a world free from nuclear weapons. And within those hosting states that Kate reminds us on the European continent, at least on paper, they're democratic states. And there is a lot of leverage we can have on pushing for those countries' citizens to demand from their governments to have these nuclear weapons removed. Because as we have seen in the case of Mongolia, having nuclear weapons on your territories puts a big pointer on the war between, let's say, nuclear weapon states by saying, well, that's not a legitimate country to target. So I think there's a long way and very effective campaigns that we can still initiate, whereby we can make advances in these democratic countries that host US nuclear warheads. That's one. Number 2, as you said, we should learn from the experiences of the establishment of other nuclear weapons-free zones and see how they are adaptable or can be curated for new regions, like namely in the Middle East. When we looked at writing our draft treaty for a WMD-free zone in the Middle East, we used the Pelindaba Treaty as a baseline for how we will do this. We looked at other international disarmament conventions as the basis for our work. Number three, we should actually aim quite big and be steadfast in the fact that we are in disarmament because we believe in disarmament, I hope. We are in this work of peace because we believe there is a possibility for peace. When we tried this in the Middle East, at the beginning, I assure you, a lot of people were laughing at us and saying, okay, you guys are just crazy. But then when we provided a blueprint, when we provided an avenue out, it's no longer could justify the inaction from our political leaders. So we got to remove these excuses that there is a technical way we can dismantle nuclear weapons. They did it within, from 80,000 warheads to where we are at 14,000, give or take. There was a reduction. That happened. It was dismantled. We built these nuclear weapons. We can dismantle them. We know how to do it technically. We know how to do it logically. We know what is the impact now with the new studies coming out of Rutgers University and other places talking about nuclear winter and what it actually impacts. We know that the basis for why we have the TPNW and why we have the humanitarian initiative when it comes to the impact of nuclear war as being the driving force on making this a common denominator. That it is not just the fact that nuclear weapons possessed by these countries is problematic, is that any use of them will impact us all, including our ecosystems and our environment. So it is no longer like, oh, we have to wait for them. As a global community, we have to say that we're going to hold them responsible and we're not going to wait until, they decide. We're going to push that envelope as hard as we can at a time when the societal consciousness on a global level has never been this clear about the impact of nuclear war. We can go back to the Cold War era where there was, again, some understanding. But in this interconnected world, the message is quite clear that we are now at a very, very close call to a nuclear war. As Kate has outlined, as others has outlined, we have new, B6112s coming in for, upgrading these nuclear warheads on the continents. That upgrade is not just an upgrade. That comes with training. That comes with what are the forces that are going to be able to make this happen. That comes with upgrades on command and control systems. Every single nuclear weapon state is upgrading it. And we haven't even touched on the convergence of a 70-year-old technology versus a recent development in an acceleration of artificial intelligence. And what does that have impact when we have seen the advent of cyber attacks, one case in point being the Stuxnet virus on Iran's nuclear facilities? That was over a decade ago. The capabilities today are mind-blowing. And so we cannot put our heads on the sand and think that these are not connected. And we have to also stop thinking also just as a regional sort of identity. That yes, from the Middle East, we can teach the Europeans something about how we can actually get around the table and discuss this issue. Mongolia can come with some incredible ideas on how it is positioned between these crazy countries that it has to survive around. And that lessons learned surrounded by nuclear weapon states can be fundamental on how we push it. The South Korean case in terms of okay, what does that look like when your adversary is actually your own same people just to the north? So how does that communication look like? How does that dialogue look like? There are an array of things that I would like to just jump on and expand on. But the bottom line is that we should seriously think about the fact that the timing on pushing nuclear disarmament on a global level is now. We have new tools, we have new urgencies, and we have a new interconnected and alive and vibrant civil society that is eager to push this forward. So political decisions have to be made, and we cannot let them just, be on the standstill as if everything is status quo. It isn't. We're in a new reality. So let's get on with it. Sorry, thank you.
Brilliantly put, Emad. Thank you very much for that. Would any of our other speakers like to answer that question? I think we have another question as well in the chat that has come up. We are nearing the end of our time now, so maybe I'll just pose this last question, and then I'll start with you, Kate, and you can answer the last question as well as the one here in the chat from Maria Cueva, who was born in 1981, who doesn't have a real perspective on the issue. The pacifist and anti-nuclear movement was stronger in the past. Nowadays, it seems the public opinion has no strong opposition to nuclear war or war in general. So, anyone who has the clear historical perspective on why this is happening, and perhaps just to add on to that, how can we reverse that trend and again, increase the interest? And then I see we do have another question here. I'll ask them all, and maybe we do one final round for each of our speakers to answer any and all of the questions that they would like here. And so the other question then is, how will you address the deeply entrenched nuclear psychology of countries such as North Korea that legitimize nuclear weapons? I would say also countries such as the United States that legitimize nuclear weapon for security. Really all I guess, nuclear weapon possessing states have the same sort of legitimization process here. But so how can we address this psychology that is built so much into maybe not even just the political situation, but also the societal situation in many of these countries? So yeah, just again, one last round answering any and all of these questions as you see fit. We'll start with Kate, then go to Sooyoung, and then Emad and Enkhsaikhan.
Thanks very much, Sean, and thanks to everyone for those interesting questions. And yeah, to Professor Jane, I mean, absolutely what Sean is saying is correct. That's exactly the same narrative from the UK government, that we need those nuclear weapons for our security. And of course, people do point out, well, in that case, doesn't everybody need nuclear weapons, and then because Iran and so on, not allowed to have nuclear weapons, and so on. But of course, nobody should have nuclear weapons. The whole thing is a complete crazy argument. So that's something that everyone understands. The only way to actually ensure the security of all is to get rid of nuclear weapons. So and then in terms of Maria's point about feeling that the movement has kind of declined somewhat since the 1980s, and why is that? But I mean, there were specific reasons, specific conjuncture for that, some absolutely mass mobilization in the 1980s, which I did touch on earlier on, which was that in Europe, we felt that the nuclear war was going to happen with us in the middle of it. We were kind of going to be the ground for that. And we thought it was going to happen at any minute. So it was absolute terror, sheer terror, which led to those mobilizations. And for a variety of reasons, even though we are closer to nuclear war than we ever have been, or at least as close as we ever have been, that sense of immediate fear doesn't exist. And we discussed that, from time to time in C&D, and there are a number of factors that we think play a role in this. One is, of course, that people do say, well, this threat's been around a long time. It's never happened again since 1945. It's never going to happen. You're just crying wolf, to use an expression. And so there is some element of that in people's minds. We also certainly have a mass media in Britain, and no doubt many other countries, which completely plays down the risk. I mean, when there was talk, when President Putin was talking about, using nuclear weapons, there were articles in our newspapers where the mayor of London said, oh, London's prepared for such an attack, no problem, kind of thing. No, disinformation. And then, of course, in terms of, which I think is a serious and interesting question, in terms of young people looking at existential threats, they look more immediately at the question of, the climate catastrophe, which, it's not kind of, maybe it will happen. It is happening, so, and I can absolutely understand why young people in particular, may want to prioritize that. So, and we can't get into a competition with other threats. They are both existential threats, and we do what we can to link those kinds of issues too. And then just on Sean's sort of wider question earlier on about making progress towards nuclear weapons-free zones, Emad made the point about, there are 9 countries that have nuclear weapons. They are the ones holding the world to ransom. And that is very much how we feel in Britain. We are a nuclear weapons state. We are increasing they are increasing our nuclear arsenal in government. And we feel that our responsibility is to really work against our own government's nuclear weapons policy and to try and get rid of Britain's nuclear weapons. And if we're able to shift the kind of public dialogue to begin to create the political will for getting rid of nuclear weapons, then that will be our best contribution, both to the TPNW, to a nuclear weapons-free zone, and so on. So we see that as our responsibility. And of course, we work with others towards a European nuclear weapons-free zone and against the NATO nukes. But I think overarchingly, as peace activists in a nuclear weapons state, our duty and responsibility is to campaign to get rid of those nuclear weapons here in Britain. Thank you very much for a great seminar and discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. Sooyoung, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I learned a lot of today, and I think it is very timely discussion for today. And yeah, in terms of North Korea issue, I think we should think about the North Korea nuclear problem a more realistic way. International community should prove that it can be solved through dialogue, not by isolating North Korea. North Korea thinks that there's no way to ensure their regime, their security, other than nuclear weapons as for now, because we can recognize that these things in our history. So it is necessary to understand that the fundamental problem in Korean Peninsula nuclear conflict is the hostile relations. So we should think this nuclear conflict is not only the North Korea nuclear issue, but also the peace on the Korean Peninsula and normalizing relations of the Korean Peninsula issue. So I feel that it is too focused on the North Korea. In the case of the Korean Peninsula, I feel the media and international community is too focused on the North Korea nuclear issue. So this needs to be converted into discussions at the level of the Korea peace treaty on the Korean Peninsula and the common security in Northeast Asia and nuclear free zones. In my opinion, and experience in other regions also show the possibility of nuclear free zone in Northeast Asia. We have we already have many good lessons. So yeah, so I think we deal with this problem in the view of the Northeast Asia common security and nuclear free zone vision. So, and one more thing I would like to emphasize is I totally agree with Emad's opinion, because the nuclear weapon can be used at any time if they are. So, therefore, I think we should also focus on the TPNW. Nuclear weapons themselves should not be allowed it. So yeah, I think we should also focus on the TPNW treaty and the nuclear weapon free zone issue together. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Sooyoung. Emad and Enkhsaikhan, do you have any closing remarks or answers to the last two questions you would like to add in?
I think I've said enough, but I will just, I just picked up from what Kate was saying, that like it will be really important for us to also merge with these other global campaigns and movements. Climate change is directly linked to what will happen with a nuclear war. And we need to tie that rationale closer and better. We have to communicate that better. Any progress on one movement in another, say, let's say, silo will be beneficial for us all. So we have to find complementary ways for us to engage with a broader community that is dealing with the other pressing issues that our planet is facing. So it's important to do that. And again, I think the level of urgency may not be seen because it's also diluted. We've been funneled with so much coming at us, with so much disasters in a sense, that there's a sense of our own abilities to have amnesia or just shut down because there's just too much coming. So we got to be able to package this better. And I hope that by uniting with other movements, this narrative will be more effective in communicating to a broader audience, which is necessary, again, if we want to push those changes. Thank you again for this opportunity. It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. The closing word then is to you, Enkhsaikhan, and then that will be the end of our event for today.
Well, thank you very much. I just wanted to respond to the question that was raised, why there was a decline in activity of NGOs compared to previous decades and so on and so forth. I think it was connected with the fact of the end of the Cold War, the reduction of nuclear weapons from 70,000 to 14,000. That's a very good thing. And the feeling that there was a reduction of NGO activities is, I wouldn't say is fully substantiated, because maybe not many, let's say, NGOs go out to the streets and make the big demands, but nevertheless, if you follow the issues, you will see that NGOs are becoming not only just demanders of something, but providing some advice, some formulas, and so on. That's how we were able to achieve, and now we have enforced the TPNW. I participated in a number of NPT review conferences, and I know that there are many international and national NGOs that are very active, working among themselves, with their governments, and with the P5 as well. So there's no decline in activities of NGOs. But, however, as it was announced a couple of months earlier, now the situation is very, very grave. And now we're about 90 seconds from the midnight. So I guess the NGOs will be able now, especially bearing in mind what is happening in Europe in connection with the different kinds of statements, making hostages of, and so on and so forth for the nuclear issues, that I'm sure that the NGOs will be becoming more and more active, not only in demanding but providing their ideas, their suggestions, and so on and so forth. So hopefully, that it will take some time, but nevertheless, I think the NGOs will come again to make their contribution to make this world a little bit safer place, and make sure that the governments would know what is expected from their peoples. So in this, I think it is very important. As a parting word, I would say that I would like to thank you everyone for participating. I hope that this will also help us in getting in touch with each other as well, because we're all following the same issue, maybe focusing on one region or another issue, on another region, but nevertheless, I'm sure that the exchange of information and contacting with each other will be very, very helpful. I hope it's not going to be the last time that we'll be meeting in this mission. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Enkhsaikhan. Thank you to all of our speakers and all of the participants today and in the last session. We will be posting this on our YouTube channel in the coming days as well, so please feel free to share it with those others around. And this certainly will not be the last time that we discuss nuclear weapons-free zones with this group, with others, hopefully a larger group as well, as we work towards some of the next steps that we have discussed today. So thank you all again, and we wish you a great rest of your day.